Obsidian Entertainment is a studio I'd wager a lot of people, from consumers to creators in the games industry, have opinions on. Having started out with the frankly bizarre and nigh destined for shovelware business model of near exclusively working on sequel games, the studio has not only made a name for itself, but more and more stepped into a position of independence and original work. In late 2022, Obsidian released one such original work in Pentiment, a game that's proven difficult for some people to describe. Some of that difficulty comes from things like genre, so I'll quickly describe where I'd put it. Pentiment is a mystery narrative adventure that plays somewhat like the point-and-click games of yore, without any of the stuff that dragged the genre down. I've seen stuff calling it Disco Elysium in the Middle Ages, but to me, it's more like the Westwood Blade Runner game. I like to imagine these games share a timeline. Most of the connection likely hinges on time of release and the absence of combat. The people who called it Medieval Disco Elysium are, at least to me, mostly wrong on the first count and absolutely, yet understandably wrong on the second. Today I want to explore the aesthetics of Pentiment and in turn put a lens on that latter misconception, the Middle Ages descriptor and how it falls short, but also why it's a little bit forgivable and how Pentiment itself makes a case for said forgiveness. To that end, this is to be a discussion on the ways Pentiment and games more broadly create a tone and atmosphere, how a cohesive sense of the world is constructed and delivered to players. Going along with what I'd call an implicit mission statement from Pentiment, I'd also like to explore the ways games can carry historical lenses and when a game plays into or seeks to combat popular misconceptions of history. And ultimately, we'll be tackling the question of aesthetics as they play into games as both entertainment experiences and teaching tools. To help, we're also going to get into another game, Kingdom Come Deliverance by Warhorse Studios, a game which will receive further introduction later. In both cases, we're sticking to content in the first hour and almost entirely separate from any story elements, so don't worry about spoilers or not being familiar with both games. We'll also be addressing another game by Obsidian, Pillars of Eternity. Wait, no, I got those details mixed up. I mean Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, the video game of the book. Yes, really, but also no, not really. I mean, I'm not joking in the sense that the game is inexplicably very real, but we also won't actually be going into it. It does get special mention for being an animated depiction of the past, though, and I do think it's good to keep in mind that this is what Pentiment could have looked like if they were going for merely an animated style instead of a stylized one, if you follow. Up front, I'll also say that this isn't a review or comparison in a good versus bad way. Both Pentiment and KCD and their respective approaches do different things, teach different things, and likely reach different audiences. And yes, I know it's a bit deranged to be talking about an Obsidian game and not touch the writing, but I just did a hyper niche dive into KOTOR 2 and Kreia, which is literally Obsidian's first game, so yeah. Also, tangentially, if I had a complaint about Pentiment, it would probably be that many places are drenched in atmosphere, but there isn't really a diegetic way to take it in. Mostly I envision this as a bench or pew where the player can simply sit. An example of this is in Hollow Knight, where the HUD melts away and the camera pulls back and sounds sharpen or mute where appropriate. I know narrative-wise you're a bit rushed at the start, but I really wish there was a pew to sit on in Kyrsao's shrine or church. Perhaps it's a testament to the vibes of the game that the only issue which springs to mind, if you can even call it that, is not having a way to further elevate the vibes, or like a built-in lo-fi Gregorian chants and ruminate mode. With that tangent done, let's get into exploring how Pentiment uses aesthetic to do some fascinating things. To begin, let's briefly, and I mean briefly compared to how much gushing there could be, look at the way the game is presented generally. There's an ever-present option to quote-unquote zoom out and look at the pages the game is playing out on. The story takes place within a book, and that book features a blend of print and manuscript styles. This is, indirectly, a statement of one of the major themes of the game, reinforced if not thoroughly told through aesthetic. As a very small crash course, manuscripts are handwritten texts, often copied over from older text or written at the behest of patrons by monks in abbeys like that of Kyrsau in the game. As noted in-game, however, Kyrsau having a functioning scriptorium is abnormal. For some rough dates, while bearing in mind I'm sticking to the Western European tradition here, manuscripts were the typical form of recording information through the medieval era. As far back as the 6th century, by some estimates, this was the dominion of monks who sometimes had physical spaces they produced their works in called a scriptorium. By the 1300s, the practice extended into secular domains, produced in some cases extensively by scribes, though by no means did monks stop producing them. With the invention and proliferation of the printing press and later movable type in the 1450s, unsurprisingly, access to bookmaking broadened yet again. For a while, and it shows in the game, print sought to imitate the style of manuscripts, and there was a bit of aesthetic blending going on. Eventually, though, print style became more dominant. Much of this is in one way or another reflected in the game as the game progresses. If nothing else, Pentiment will show you the rise of print and its consequences. Okay, all clear? I could spend some time talking about the aesthetics of the landscapes and setting, the world in Pentiment, but the strongest case for the impact of aesthetics beyond the general presentation is found in its characters. Something you may have recognized, or at least picked up on without fully knowing what you're holding, is that characters are different from each other in very intentional stylistic ways that correspond to their identities. Take the inhabitants of the scriptorium. The older brothers look different, and it's not just to represent their age, though that is what they're doing. Okay, hold up. This is a game that straddles the 15th and 16th century, and as such, in the scriptorium, there are two old monks who are drawn in an aging style. They are physically represented in the art style they themselves know, an old style. If the goal was just to draw an old man, that could be done in a woodcut style, but instead, the elder monks are rendered in the tradition of their disappearing trade. This goes beyond equating an old person to an old style once one considers the nature of the elder brothers as a disappearing societal role. Adolf and Piero are depicted in the ways they themselves create. They represent a style distinct from that of the secular artist protagonist Andreas. What that distinction does is highlight the disappearing role, the change of time, and I think in a very tangible way that the medieval and early modern aka Renaissance period didn't just magically jump cut from one to the next. History is gradual waves of change, just as much as it is dramatic moments of upheaval, intense programs of development, and old traditions persisting. There's no date for when the world entered the Renaissance. Even acknowledging the gradual spread of ideas, it's not like the Renaissance is a measurable condition. Just as technologies and traditions and styles spread rather gradually, there's no perfect checklist or singular defining cultural innovation. Thus, the temporal aspect is as gradual as the spatial one. It's not like 1500 rolled around and everyone forged their plate mail into plowshares and plowshares into muskets. The scriptorium, ultimately, is noted more than once to be a near anachronistic oddity by residents and visitors to Kiersau, and, of course, it plays host to the signifiers of changing times. Beyond that, the broader game spans decades and reflects change as change comes to Tassing. The game sets this tension up as a broader theme in its writing, so of course it follows suit with its style. I mean, who's ever heard of games having elements of their message and themes harshly conflict with gameplay and design? Being a game about an artist, the idea of how change affects his craft is going to be pretty central, but it's not the only place we see aesthetic used to reinforce what the game is saying. There's another man in Kiersau that stands out in his aesthetic. Brother Savat, the Ethiopian monk. I'm sure a lot of players noted that he looks different from most characters you meet. That's intentional and multi-layered. For one, his narrative as we're introduced to him involves his otherness, visible differences between him, an Ethiopian man, and the residents of Alpine Germany. His otherness being translated into style is impactful. He could have just been drawn in a Western manuscript or woodcut style but with Ethiopian features, but instead he's represented in an entirely different artistic tradition, an Ethiopian Orthodox one. He is represented by his culture in his identity. Like the monks of the scriptorium, the aesthetic is more than a nice touch. Like race in the real-world 16th century, it's more than a difference of appearance. It's also a very different concept than it is today, but that is a really big topic for another time. An inclusion of this aesthetic element introduces the player to yet another idea of real-world history that they may not have considered before. Players are introduced to the idea that there are many scriptorial traditions. And speaking of something I never considered before, horses. Admittedly, this is an odd and perhaps very anecdotal thing to mention, but the horses are strange in a good way. They're faithful to the inspiration art, and in turn it gives them a kind of cartoony vibe. While one could never argue that manuscripts were going for pure realism, or as every edgy 14-year-old know-it-all soon-to-be self-professed history buff would say, the Middle Ages were bad at realism, there's a distinction I find funny where the humans are human representational, but the horses are a bit anthropomorphized. Like, they don't have black dot eyes, they're not just real horses but medieval style, you know? In said faithful representation, the horses can fit in just as much as they stand out. This isn't a criticism of any sort, so much as just a moment of revelation. I've looked at the Morgan Bible many times and never thought about the way the horses are in the style in such a playful way. I mean, look at the expressions here. And to my credit, the horses I had in mind are on the one page of the Morgan Bible that's in the Getty Museum, which Hannah Kennedy and her team at Obsidian had access to in developing the game's aesthetic. I don't know how this never clicked for me until watching these guys wiggle around. And of course, that's to say nothing of the other ways animals are anthropomorphized, but that's a tangent. The horses are a metric of sorts. They give us something to measure the aesthetic of the game against. It's so simple that it may almost sound like a non-point to say that they're done in a manuscript style, but in doing so, they reinforce the style of the whole game. In an odd way, I'm compelled to say that if the horses had been more correct to reality while still in the style, my brain would have picked up on it. If they'd had more horse-like features but still been manuscripty, it would have been immersion breaking. Which in turn begs the question, is this stylized approach capable of immersion? And the short answer is yes, because I've felt immersed. The longer answer is, unsurprisingly, more complicated, and to get there, let's compare this to a game that has a very different approach to a similar goal. As a general rule, I tend to find games that go for a certain timelessness in their style appealing. I'm sure every day someone in the world is discussing how Wind Waker is, graphically speaking, timeless compared to games that chase realism. While I have thoughts on that, I don't know that there's much I can add to the general discussion that hasn't already been said. But I want to make a case towards the value of immersive realism, alongside the broader discussion of the ways aesthetic can be used to impart a sense of time and place in games with historical settings. Kingdom Come: Deliverance is the first game by Czech indie developers Warhorse Studios. While its intro may look like this, the gameplay looks like this. Yeah, there's a big difference. As stated before, I'm well aware of the Sisyphean task that is trying to make timeless, high-fidelity graphics. While there's both explicit and implicit ways that chasing fidelity limits the reach of a game as much as it seeks to broaden appeal, I don't think it would be fair to write any game off for chasing fidelity. And there's something interesting in bringing to life a world that isn't, by nature, fantastical so much as it is foreign to us by virtue of temporal setting. I'd wager that most renditions of settings you'd compare Kingdom Come: Deliverance to are fictional, your Witchers, your Skyrims. While the locations of The Witcher 3 are inspired by real-world places in Poland, there's no actual call to credibility for The Witcher's depiction, so to speak. That's not to say they didn't do their homework, but that CD Projekt's mission in making the Witcher series has no actual obligation to historicity in its realism so much as uses history, uses reality, to create plausible environments. From that, we tap right into one of the stated design intents behind KCD, fidelity that goes beyond graphics into historicity. Hands down the largest selling point that brought me, and I suspect many other Kickstarter funders to the game, was the idea of, what if immersive Bethesda-style RPG but real-world setting without magic? And on the face of it, I imagine that sounds a bit silly. I mean, who doesn't want magic? Isn't the real world kinda boring? Isn't that why we make fantasy in the first place? Where's the escapism? To which I can point at my original hope for Assassin's Creed, actually. The short of it being that I wanted a game exploring a historical setting grounded in reality, or letting the extent of reality bending be in acrobatics, not in magic. It turns out Ubisoft did not, in the end, share my ideal. The escape is into the otherness of a time foreign to us, and, as we'll get to, a bit of bending when it comes to player freedom and social mobility. But then again, an accurate peasantry simulator for the time would be a game that's like 90% grinding wheat, 10% getting trampled by a photogenic horse. KCD stands in contrast to Pentiment in its presentation, and of course, in genre. I don't want to imagine the version of Pentiment on CryEngine. It's rather obvious how high graphic fidelity serves immersion. What's less obvious is that a historical setting with no magic and all the realism has a chance of ending up mundane. Now, as for if the game actually ended up with no magic, it kinda depends on how you view the potion making system, which I absolutely side-eyed when I found it was in the game. Where Pentiment's immersive potential rests on its narrative and a strong stylistic cohesion, KCD relies on creating a real world. something our brains see the shape of in a very full way. Through that, KCD is able to set a different record from Pentiment. Where Pentiment explores the mutability of eras in its style, KCD grounds the consistency of human experience in its realism. Apples look like apples, hands look like hands. We're primed to relate to the world of KCD in this way. Where our familiarity with Pentiment is one towards the aesthetic it adopts, KCD is a familiarity towards the real world. Which is not to say that realism is an absence of aesthetic. KCD is almost an attempt at romanticized social history in a sense, certainly a near epistolary perspective. While it's not literally writing letters, a game like this can be taken as a retelling of events, of Henry's life and experiences as they're destined to happen, like a journal or diary. We live vicariously a day in the life of 1403 Bohemia, as it were. I think it's a fantastic way to depict history, and while I don't expect Warhorse intends or anticipates it being a teaching tool in ways that see the game assigned as homework, it's very clear that they view it as a means of teaching people history. The game is absolutely inspired by a sense of grounded realism, and that inspiration, of course, lines up with social and societal structures. You're not a king, and you aren't the guy in a fantasy protagonist or chosen one way. You're just someone in the world and can only be involved so much, only elevated so far. That said, it's not like the developers intended a perfect objective depiction of or window into history. It is, after all, a fictional story in a real world, and of course, the amount of heroics you get up to is a fictional quantity. You fight a lot of guys. And the fact you're allowed social mobility at all is a product of gameplay more than history. Similar to the ways I talked about Sturgia in the Bannerlord video, there's a tension, a natural conflict in these kinds of games between accuracy and player expectations. Kingdom Come does what it can to be realistic, but it also takes liberties that start to pile up. If anything, making a game about a lower-class figure forging his own destiny would probably have better fit the Hussian side of the Hussite Wars, and if you look back far enough, that's when it was originally set. But in the game we got, the developers seem anemic to the idea given how they paint Huss as reviled by nobles and peasants alike, which is certainly a lens one could take. Not one I think meshes with actual history, but that brings in another issue entirely, so let's briefly address that. I cannot in good faith go without mentioning that while the game has been praised for its depictions of the material aspects of the late Middle Ages, it has, over time, garnered some scrutiny. It's been suggested that KCD shows a consistent bias against the Cumans and Hungarians while putting far less diligence into their accurate depiction. In turn, when pressed on numerous inaccuracies, there's been a routine retreat into, guys, it's just a game, we had to make changes so it could be fun. But we're not talking changes like letting players use a steel forging method that wasn't discovered until a decade later, or sneaking a purchasable katana into the inventory of one merchant. We're talking romanticization and oversimplification of the narrative, of history. Dedication to certain vectors of accuracy doesn't free one from applying a historical lens or imparting their own bias. And keep in mind, I'm not comparing the two games to say thing good versus thing bad. Both approaches have a distinct value, and ultimately the games are more interesting to us right now for their presentation, and in turn, how that presentation is part of the greater interest of teaching players something. Another major focus of both Pentiment and Kingdom Come is education. Both games seek to impart new knowledge onto players, from small anecdotes and historical context and freestanding facts to new perspectives and appreciations for the nuance of historical eras. The approaches differ far less than the game aesthetics. If you've been a longtime watcher, or perhaps had the misfortune of seeing me on Twitter, you'll know that I'm a big proponent of nested tooltips. I'm 95% sure the first time I saw them was Tyranny, another Obsidian game actually, and I was immediately sold that they should be industry standard, at least for PC games where it's easy to integrate into the UI. No joke, that was one of the first things I was most excited to see when I booted up CK3 for the first time. While Tyranny and a growing list of CRPGs use nested tooltips to give lore tidbits or help players keep track of names, and CK3 uses them to keep track of mechanics, Pentiment does something a little different. The nested information isn't too dense, nor is it too out there. It doesn't tangent into details Andreas wouldn't likely know. You can click to see characters of the game when underlined, but unless they're a fully off-screen character, they just get a portrait. I find this to be a great way to integrate this information without succumbing to an amnesia subplot. Andreas should know who the people he lives with are, you know? Conversations where the main character totally blanks on some basic thing they ought to know are, to me, the most self-defeating diegetic action in games. On that front alone, I find this system invaluable for games within and beyond the genres mentioned. But another use of those tooltips arises for historical setting. Much like using them to remind or inform players of background lore in Tyranny or Kingmaker, Pentiment is able to impart historical details and facts onto players in a way that doesn't break the pace of the game. If anything, it functions just like those fictional world background lore bits. It world builds. The setting is made richer. The Holy Roman Empire feels more real for having read about the function and importance of places like Worms, Fulda, and Erfurt, even though we aren't seeing them. And yes, I get how silly it sounds to call real historical facts world building, but I mean it as a function of delivering information. These bits functionally flesh out our understanding of a setting foreign to us, potentially otherworldly. Or maybe you're built different, maybe you were just born with an inherent knowledge of the Archbishop of Mainz's position as the papal legate beyond the Alps. Or you're an immortal alchemist or something. But those are edge cases. For most people, this functionally is world building. The dual function of depth and education strings right into the aesthetic and immersion. Every bit of it is imparting something, teaching something, even if it's not annoyingly pedagogical. Once again, KCD takes a differing approach here. Kingdom Come also recognizes the foreignness of its setting with an explicit desire to become familiar. Beyond the tangible material realities the game attempts to represent, there's lore, like in Pentiment. The player has access to a codex in the menus that describes all sorts of context and additional information for the story. Rather than fixate on telling you what every character's birthday and personality is, the codex centers on historical events and material culture. Further, as you see new things and meet new people, your codex fills out. There's an exploratory element to it all. Pentiment also has a glossary for keeping track of characters and tooltips, but it's a bit less dense with information. I don't think it's trivial or incidental that these games care about presentation and certain accuracies while also providing their respective contextualizing encyclopedias. While I favor nested tooltip systems, I am also the type of person to get lost in reading encyclopedia entries in games. I'm the idiot the Civilopedia was made for, and that's why I know it's bad. Sorry, wrong video. But on the subject of the Civilopedia and differing methods of teaching, I tend to find that while strategy games like those I tend to cover have a wealth of information they can convey, a world of teaching they can do, games like Pentiment and KCD do things that those games simply can't. I've critiqued EU4 before for how it inadvertently blends the eras too much. Everything feels too samey from 1444 to 1821. The game lacks the depth needed to make every era distinct, and we're talking about a game people joke is taking hundreds of hours to really learn. History games have a tendency to go broad or go home, often by virtue of being empire builders. Zooming things in but providing world building and context further a sense of immersion, which furthers curiosity and interest and investment. Both of these games take their time showing a moment in history, a single life, but a single life accompanied with setting and sound and context. But that leads us back to the big question. Does the art itself help impart the time period? In some sense, this is a setting seldom explored. When we think Renaissance, media often gravitates towards the city centers, the places of great change, the sites of rebirth themselves. And while those may largely be in Italy, Andreas represents those places, both in his static background and profession as a Nuremberger artist, and in his more malleable background as one who traveled the Low Countries, Switzerland, or Italy, as well as his varying potential degrees. Pentiment itself remarks on Kirzau being between eras, sometimes stuck in the past, sometimes pushing to the present. And I think this makes a nice metaphor for how we approach understanding historical eras, that often we frame these things as binary declarations, that the Renaissance is now. But Tassing, even in its most early modern moments, could never look like our archetypes. It cannot be Florence, it isn't Hamburg, it won't become a Venice of the Alps. In its aesthetic, Pentiment sets a record as much as it risks confusing people. It inhabits the real, gradual, transitory way that history moves. In doing so, I'm sure it has people saying it's a game about the Middle Ages with medieval manuscript art, and it's fine to enter the game thinking that because the game teaches you otherwise. It's not like you won't get Pentiment if you don't understand what a woodcut or an illumination is. Pentiment is an attempt to dispel oversimplification just as much as it is a treat for those who have craved complexity and nuance and accuracy. Given the edification elements we talked about in the prior section, I have to see all of this as intentional. That it wasn't just an attempt to make a pretty game in a fun style, but to make a point that coincides its themes and corrects a record. Kingdom Come Deliverance isn't deeply stylized to make a point so much as intent on realizing a fragment of the past. In doing so, it imparts truth that goes beyond pop perceptions. Granted, I'm not sure how many people have a preconceived notion of early 15th century Bohemia, but they certainly do of the past. Given the number of times I've seen people point at fantasy as their window for understanding the medieval era, from its harshness to its social hierarchies to its technology, it's refreshing to have a game out there trying to counteract some of that. And while I think more games should dare to be stylistic like Pentiment, I still see the value in a presentation like KCD's. I especially see that value when set towards helping people immerse themselves in history. There's value to both approaches, in the same way that not everyone learns through the same methods. And it's not like the field of early modern historical narrative games is oversaturated. The more the merrier. That all said, Pentiment does face a unique challenge, and it's one I find they rise to meet. Pentiment has to be stylistically pleasant and recognizable while holding true to its own sense of accuracy. To recontextualize something I said earlier, it's a different game of graphic fidelity. Pentiment has to look like its inspirations enough that we recognize what we're looking at and can catch all of its meaning in its details, the intent behind it. Rather than making sure that swords aren't clipping through chairs and that the dirt looks sufficiently dirty, Obsidian's work of adopting a style, indeed styles within styles, requires a wholly different attention to detail. I'm sure there's some things here and there in the style that one could scrounge to nitpick about when certain techniques or literal colors were developed compared to the game timeline, but I think it's fair to say they nailed it. And I also think it's fair to say that the aesthetics are impossible to remove from the teaching element of the game. Pentiment is its aesthetic as much as it is its words, is its setting, and is history. And there you have it. I managed to do a whole video about Pentiment without going on another 4-minute rant about the misuse of the term Dark Ages. The next time I mention Obsidian will be either to talk about tyranny and lawful evil, or a hyper-specific, unfixed bug in Fallout New Vegas that has bothered me since the day the game came out. Who knows when that will be though. Big thanks to Ludo History for his much appreciated insight. I'll leave a link to his channel where links are found. His work centers on history and games, if the name didn't give it away, so I'm sure that'll appeal to many of you. Also, thanks to everyone who helped by financing my questionable life path of becoming a niche internet micro-celebrity or whatever. Special thanks goes to Jan Orsol, Chandler Mason, Defender, Freddy, Galactic Beyond, Mark Soto, Nick, Node Squiggler, and Ziad Kamil. If you're inclined to subscribe and stuff, there's a button for it somewhere. Bye.